Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Mike here at Gamefromscratch, and Unity 7 is dead. Yes, that sounds very clickbaity, but the reality is it is 100% true with a very small asterisk. What's the small asterisk? Well, Unity 7 didn't technically exist as a product name. Instead, it was once called Unity Next Generation. Now, before we get too far into that, a quick heads up. If you are looking for some audio for your game, dynamic game soundtracks or sound effect packs, you can't do better than Ovani. And given that it's Black Friday month, you can actually get 3 bundles from Ovani right now for an incredible price. If you're looking for some game audio, you've got packs here that were curated by Thomas Brush and Blackthorn Productions, as well as one other bundle here as well, or you could get them all together. By the way, if you use my link, it does help support me. All right, back to the Unity 7 news. Unity just had their annual developer conference, Unite 2025. I covered mostly on the whole Tim Sweeney Epic Games surprise collaboration when I talked about it earlier on, but there was another major thing that happened at Unite 2025, or more specifically, didn't happen, and that is zero mention at all of Unity 7 or Unity Next Generation or anything. And this is key because Unity 7 is going to be, or was going to be, the future of Unity. So this was announced back at Unite 2023. Now, you may recall 2023 was not a great year for Unity. It was a terrible year for Unity. That is when they announced the runtime feed. You remember that one? They definitely do. Well, most do, because frankly, Unity bled for that one. The entire C-suite is gone. The people running the company are now completely different. And that new CEO coming in, he has set a different development roadmap going forward. And one of the big things that, again, in 2023, they announced this Unity Next Generation, or shorthand, Unity 7. So what was Unity 7 all about? Well, it was about paying tech debt, basically. Years and years of building things in Unity. Eventually, you gotta break things. You gotta standardize on the future and have a common thing going forward. You see, way back in like 2018-ish, Unity announced the data-oriented technology stack. That's when we got things like the entity component system, the burst compiler, and so on. This was basically going to be the new way to program in Unity, to get you high-performance capabilities out of it. And that technically went production-ready in Unity 2022. At least parts of it did. We're still sort of waiting on it being standardized as part of Unity, which is kind of insane. And when you think about how long it took for DOTS to come to fruition, think about how long it would have actually taken for Unity 7 to develop. But on top of that, Unity 7 was going to do things like standardize the pipelines. That was another thing that they did. They created scriptable render pipelines, which basically turned into the universal render pipeline and the HDRP, or the high definition render pipeline. The universal render pipeline was meant for lower end and mobile devices. The HDRP was meant for higher end devices. The problem is each one of those created a duplicate workflow. So if you created a tool for URP, you had to implement it for URP. Same for HDRP. And then the same thing was true for any asset store makers. They had to make their assets for both versions. Plugin makers had to make their tools work on both versions. Basically, this split pipelines was a cool idea, terrible implementation. So what they're now looking at is bringing those back together. We're going to have one pipeline to rule them all. On top of that, we were also going to have improvements to the core infrastructure. These are things like asset importing. It takes a long time now. Hopefully, these underpinnings were going to improve all of that. On top of that, DOTS was going to be built in. It was going to exist side by side with game objects, but now you would have things like burst and entity basically being built into the engine itself at a core level, and not as like a plugin or an add-on there. And then on top of that, we also have the core CLR. Now, this is probably the thing that the majority of people are waiting for, and why waiting for Unity 7 would have been so painful, because core CLR basically is the .NET runtime. So right now, Unity uses Mono, and Mono is long in the tooth. It has some issues, especially around things like JIT, and on top of that, it's not really under development anymore. Microsoft handed it off to the Wine Foundation, and it's basically out to pasture. So if you want to have support for the newest version of C#, for example, you need to have core CLR. So that is key. The key programming language in using the Unity game engine is C#. So obviously having the latest and greatest and highest performance version is a good thing. But Core CLR was going to be pushed down to Unity 7. That means anyone working on Unity 6 point whatever, they were out of luck. So you would have to wait for a couple of years for this new version to come that hopefully would come and become beta or so on within the next couple of years. So basically, the CEO took a look at this and said, okay, we're going to push all of our functionality years down the road and tell all of our developers to just, wait and stand by. And I think he thought that that was a pretty stupid idea. And I can understand his thinking on that. We also had another set of features announced for Unity 7. One was a new animation system, and the other one was world building tools. Well, bad news. Those two, they joined the dodo. Those are basically on the back burner, not under active development. So if you're waiting on the world building tools and the new animation system, I'm sorry to say, you're going to wait for a long time. Although, all those other things, the good news is you should get them much faster. You see, they've taken the core features that they have announced for Unity going forward, and they're going to be building them into upcoming releases of Unity 6. So we will eventually get a Unity 7, but it's just going to be Unity 6.9 plus 0.1 kind of thing. It's going to just literally be the next version. Nothing big, nothing breaking, literally just an iterative version. Another thing about that whole iterative version is Unity announced that they're going to focus on making it so that you can actually use these versions. So if you're developing your game right now using 6.2 and 6.3 comes along, you should be able to upgrade and actually take advantage of it. Well, it'd be interesting to see how that actually turns out. So now I've got a little bit of timelines about what is going on in Unity land with this new development priorities that they've got. So immediately we've got 6.3. 6.3 should be dropping literally any day now. I think this week, in fact. So 6.3 is currently in beta, coming very, very soon. And we're starting to see some of the consolidations that they're talked about that were coming to Unity 7 already in 6.3. The biggest one you're going to see is the Universal Render Pipeline and HDRP are both going to use Shader Graph as a back end. In fact, in 6.4, compatibility mode will go away, and Shader Graph will be the only option available. Speaking of 6.4, and in terms of the timeline, so 6.3 is now. 6.4 is going to be early 2026. I'm guessing probably beta in GDC because you got to announce something at GDC, but that's just a guess. So early 2026, we're going to get 6.4, and then we're also going to get 6.5 and 6.6 in the 2026 timeline. So we're going to have tighter, faster developments going on there in terms of the feature sets. And then in 2027 is where we should start seeing 6.7. So what are we going to expect to see in these? Well, 6.4, part of that DOTS technology stack is going to be core, and that is entities. Entities will now be a core module. Right now, it's basically an add-on that you have to do. You can now think of entities as part of Unity, which is long overdue. A nice thing is they have built these compatibility layers so that components and game objects and entities can play well together. That's something that didn't originally exist when DOTS was announced, and a big part of why DOTS was so damn confusing early on. And then in 6.5, another example of the pipelines coming together is you're going to see a unification of the upscaling solutions. So Unity created their own thing, and plus they support things like DLSS and FSR. Those will all be available across the pipelines. So again, moving towards that single pipeline. And then entities and game objects will work together on the same runtime back end. That is 6.6. So that's when entities and game objects can be used interchangeably going forward. A bunch of other things going with these particular releases, but this is sort of a roadmap of those key Unity 7 features and where they're going to come up in the timeline. Now, one thing you may have noticed is I have not mentioned Core CLR yet. Well, Core CLR is actually being worked on internally, I believe as of like Unity 6.4-ish. It's an internal experimental feature that they are working on getting CLR up and running. But the first public release of CLR is going to be Unity 6.7. And 6.7, again, is that early 2027 release. So if you're waiting on CLR, know that it's not going to be immediate for sure. But on the bright side, you're not waiting for Unity 7, so it's not going to be like a 2030s thing either. And then at the same time, you got more of the amalgamation of the pipelines. What you're going to have is the Universal Render Pipeline is going to get SSR from the HDRP, at which point I think we're going to start seeing the Universal Render Pipeline is now just the pipeline. I don't think you will see new features added to the HDRP. I saw very few things announced on the roadmap when it comes to the HDRP, whereas a lot of things are coming to the URP. So I think the URP is going to be the one pipeline to rule them all ultimately. I don't think they have formally said this out loud, But, with the Unity Next, they very much announced a unified pipeline. And I do believe at that point in time, it was rallied around the universal render pipeline. And I don't think even with this realignment of priorities, I still think that is ultimately true. And then when we got 6.8 and beyond, details are very limited, but we're definitely going to see more CLR, and more CLR going forward. So that is kind of it. We got a realignment of priorities. So instead of pushing everything off to one major release where we just break everything all at once, we're going to move to more incremental releases where each of these features that you saw in Unity 7 are going to be added over time, so we actually get our hands on them in a much earlier basis. I can definitely see the business logic behind this change. I can see the business logic behind the other one as well, but something about telling your developers and partners, etc., to say, we've got a solution to everything, it's just going to be 5 years down the road, that wasn't very palatable. I can understand why they would not want to go that route. And again, the one bit of bad news in here is if you were waiting on those new Unity 7 animation and world building tools, don't hold your breath. All right, that's it. So that is it. Unity 7 is very much dead. Technically, Unity 7 was never really a thing. It was called Unity Next Generation. They may have actually rebranded it to Unity Next 1.0 or whatever. I don't think that decision was ever formally made. But for shorthand, calling it Unity 7 made a lot of sense. And just don't call it that anymore because it no longer makes any sense. A big change in priority and development direction between Unite 2023 and Unite 2025, but I think that they've actually moved to one that they can actually attain. So I have much more faith in this roadmap than in the previous roadmap, even though the previous one might have been a little bit sexier. Let me know what you think. Comments down below. I will talk to you all later. Goodbye.